Greetings, my name is Stan Prager from the Regarp book blog, www.regarp.com. Today's podcast features my review of Question 7 by Richard Flanagan. Wednesday, June 17, 1881. A train had to leave Station A at 3 a.m. in order to reach Station B at 11 p.m. Just as the train was about to depart, however, an order came the train had to reach Station B by 7 p.m. Who is capable of loving longer, a man or a woman? That is Question 7, excerpted from a little-known early short story by Anton Chekhov entitled Questions Posed by a Mad Mathematician. Of course, there can be no answer to such an absurd question. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay's bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, released a lever 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, and 43 seconds later, some 60,000 or 80,000 or 140,000 people, no one really knows, died. At that same moment, 80 miles to the south of Ground Zero, Arch Flanagan, who had miraculously survived a stretch as slave laborer on the infamous Burma Death Railway, was pushing carriages of rock up long dark tunnels in a coal mine under the inland sea. Now in his fourth year as a Japanese POW, physically and psychologically broken, the skeletal creature that still endured fully expected death to take him soon. He could hardly know then that the atomic bomb that killed 60,000 or 80,000 or 140,000 people that morning would mean that he would be spared. Nor could he have imagined that about 16 years later a son would be born to him who would go on to become an internationally acclaimed author and who would win the Man Booker Prize for his novel The Narrow Road to the Deep North, inspired by Arch's brutal experience on the Burma Railway. There is much that is unknowable in life, but it is almost certain that if not for the bomb nicknamed Little Boy, that would mean death for 60,000 or 80,000 or 140,000 Japanese souls, Tasmanian novelist Richard Flanagan would never have been born. Were the lives of Arch Flanagan, or Richard Flanagan for that matter, or the hundreds of thousands of other Japanese and European and American and Australian survivors of the war worth the sacrifice of the 60,000 or 80,000 or 140,000 human beings who perished at Hiroshima on that day? Of course, there can be no answer to such an absurd question. But that paradox clearly haunted the author, and it informs every single page of his own Question 7, a mesmerizing literary tour de force that is styled as a memoir, but is in every way so very much more than that. One reviewer branded it genre-bending, and while I am ever reluctant to borrow from others when composing my own reviews, I surely cannot improve upon that. But then, as someone who has read every novel penned by Richard Flanagan can attest, genre-bending is what defines his art. From my very first encounter with him in Gould's Book of Fish, which I described elsewhere as a stunningly original and brilliant blend of satire, heartache, love, cruelty, comedy, and existential tragedy, tossed with a superb use of magical realism. Think William Faulkner, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and John Irving, all stirring the same pot with different shaped spoons, to the more mainstream literary fiction of The Narrow Road to the Deep North, a historical novel focused on extremes of brutality and endurance that turns out after all to be a love story that likewise manages to qualify as a magnificent achievement. At this point, it is only fair to issue a kind of spoiler alert, because it seems to me that it would be nearly impossible to do justice to Flanagan's work here without giving much of the story away, which yet sounds a bit weird because this is mostly nonfiction, that hardly suggests a cliffhanger at the end. I say mostly nonfiction because while this is essentially an autobiography, the author admits to a certain literary license here and there. And if I state that it is essentially an autobiography, I must immediately contradict myself because, in fact, it steps far beyond memoir to history, literature, and nuclear physics, as well as speculative challenges to the notions of both teleology and existentialism that somehow manages not to reinforce nihilism. And there we are back to genre bending. By the way, Flanagan never once cites schools of philosophy, though his musings repeatedly compel the mind of the reader to go there. He also never refers to quantum mechanics, but as I turned the pages, I could not help but think of quantum probabilities and the many worlds theory that insists that anything that can occur actually does occur elsewhere in the multiverse, but is hidden from us because by observing an event, we manifest only our own reality and obscure all the others. In a different take on the familiar butterfly effect, I suppose, in at least one of those worlds there is and never has been a Richard Flanagan. It would hardly be giving too much away to point out that Flanagan plucked the title for his book from that brain bender in the Chekhov short story. That he would turn to a corner of literature so utterly obscure for this purpose only underscores the eclectic range of the author's intellect. Nearly as unfamiliar to most is The World Set Free, a 1914 novel by polymath H.G. Wells that predicted the development of the atomic bomb as a weapon of war. As Flanagan tells it, this sci-fi flight of fancy was written in part during a period that saw Wells distracted by his infatuation with the decades younger journalist Rebecca West. Hardly as successful as his prior bestsellers, The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, if indeed more prescient, The World Set Free was largely forgotten, except by atomic scientist Leo Szilard, who upon reading it in the early 1930s became obsessed by the implications, which later sparked an epiphany that had him conceive the concept of a chain reaction that could lead to nuclear detonation. As it turned out, Szilard became part of the group that was to persuade FDR to launch a race to develop the bomb before Hitler could do so, as well as a key figure in the Manhattan Project that was to result in the creation of Little Boy and the deaths of 60,000 or 80,000 or 140,000 men, women, and children in Hiroshima in August 1945. But also spare the life of Arch Flanagan, and thus make possible the birth of Richard Flanagan some years later. Talk about the butterfly effect. Despite the spoilers, there's a good deal more to Question 7, and it will definitely make you think. Like Gould's Book of Fish, which I reread immediately after I turned the final page, I will likely read this one again at some point. There really is so much to ponder in what is, after all, a rather short book, given its dramatic scope. I especially enjoyed his treatment of the steamy relationship that rose between Wells and West, literary license and all, which reminded me a bit of his tortured portrait of Charles Dickens in Flanagan's Wanting, another outstanding effort. He also revisits the genocide that led to the almost complete extermination of Aborigines by white settlers in what was then the convict colony of Van Diemen's Land, a topic that runs through many of his books. The climate change-driven fires that have forever disfigured the Tasmania that he knew in his youth, and his own near-death experience in a drowning incident that would later beget the substance of his superlative first novel, Death of a River Guide. Much as in Cormac McCarthy's fiction, the universal themes that characterize Flanagan's work frequently identify the prevalence of cruelty and evil in the world, while ever holding out the hope, no matter how tiny, that love and compassion could ultimately prevail. In Question 7, there's the compelling account of the all-too-real-life encounters between the author and certain elderly Japanese men who had, many years before, once been the very sadistic camp guards who had cruelly victimized Arch Flanagan. They now seem like such nice, older gentlemen. At the site of the mine, where Arch once wasted away, local guides denied that slave labor ever existed, a potent reminder that history can not only be forgotten, but intentionally scrubbed. A process sadly in progress across the United States today. Arch Flanagan never fully recovered from his trauma as a prisoner of war, but he managed to live on to the ripe old age of 98. To hear his son relate back to him the stories of visits with other old men who had once viciously abused him. He passed away on the same day his now famous son confided that the final draft of The Narrow Road to the Deep North was complete. What does any of this actually mean? Of course, there can be no answer to such absurd questions, but we must nevertheless keep asking. At least, that's my takeaway after closing the cover of Question 7. I struggled to locate the text of questions posed by a mad mathematician on the web, and finally resorted to buying the collection, The Undiscovered Chekhov, 43 New Stories, in order to read it. At less than 2 pages long, the story proved anticlimactic, but I did get to read all the other questions. The final one, Question 8, is my favorite. My mother-in-law is 75, and my wife 42. What time is it? Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I encourage you to share it in your network. Many more reviews and an eclectic array of fiction and nonfiction books are available at regarp.com and regarpbookblogpod.com. Have a great day.